The morning air in London carried an unusual weight that Tuesday. Kate Middleton had woken up earlier than normal, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite organize. She sat by the window of Kensington Palace watching the city slowly come to life. The streets below were already filling with people, though the sun had barely risen. Something important was happening today and everyone seemed to know it. She had been preparing for this moment for weeks, maybe even months. Every speech, every appearance, every smile had led to this particular day. Kate wasn't nervous in the traditional sense. She had stood before crowds thousands of times since marrying into the royal family. But today felt different. Today wasn't about protocols or ceremonies. It was about something much deeper, something that connected to the very heart of what it meant to serve others. Her assistant knocked softly on the door, reminding her that the car would be ready in an hour. Kate nodded, though her eyes remained fixed on the horizon. She thought about the people she would meet today. Real people with real struggles, families who had faced unimaginable challenges, children who had shown courage beyond their years. These were the people who inspired her, who reminded her why her position mattered beyond the jewels and the titles. The event was being held at Westminster Abbey, a place soaked in history and reverence. It had been chosen specifically because of its significance, its ability to make people pause and reflect. The occasion was a memorial service for families affected by a recent national tragedy. Several months earlier, a series of accidents and incidents across the country had left dozens of families grieving. The nation had mourned collectively, but these families had carried the heaviest burden. Kate had met many of them privately over the past weeks. She had sat in their living rooms, held their hands, and listened to their stories. Each meeting had left an imprint on her heart. There was the mother who had lost her teenage son in a car accident, the father whose daughter had died while serving as a volunteer firefighter, the elderly couple whose grandson had passed away from a sudden illness. Every story was unique, yet they all shared a common thread of love and loss. As she dressed for the event, Kate chose her outfit carefully. Nothing too bright or flashy. A simple navy dress with minimal accessories. This wasn't a day for fashion statements. Her hair was pulled back elegantly but without elaborate styling. She wanted to blend in, to be present as a human being rather than as a figure on a pedestal. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw not a duchess but a woman who understood that today was about others, not herself. The drive to Westminster Abbey took longer than expected. The roads were lined with people holding flowers, photographs, and handwritten signs. Some stood in silence, others wiped tears from their eyes. The outpouring of public emotion was overwhelming. Kate watched through the tinted windows of the car, her heart growing heavier with each passing block. This wasn't just a ceremony, it was a moment of collective healing, a chance for an entire nation to acknowledge pain and offer comfort. Security was tight around the Abbey. Officers stood at every corner, but they too seemed affected by the solemnity of the day. As Kate's car pulled up to the entrance, she could see the families already gathering inside. Through the ancient doorway, she caught glimpses of people embracing, sharing tissues, supporting one another. The king had arrived earlier and was speaking quietly with some of the attendees. Other members of the royal family were scattered throughout the crowd, each doing their part to offer presence and compassion. Kate stepped out of the car, and immediately the atmosphere shifted. Photographers clicked away, but even they seemed subdued. She walked slowly up the steps, pausing to acknowledge a group of children who had come with their parents. One little girl, no more than 7 years old, held out a small bouquet of daisies. Kate knelt down to accept them, speaking softly to the child. The girl's mother stood nearby, tears streaming down her face. Kate stood and embraced her. No words necessary. The moment said everything. Inside the Abbey, the air was cool and heavy with incense. Hundreds of candles flickered along the walls, casting dancing shadows across the stone floors. The pews were filled with families, friends, community members, and dignitaries. Everyone had come together for one purpose: to remember, to honor, and to support. The service would include readings, prayers, and musical performances. But the most anticipated moment was the tribute that Kate herself would deliver. She had written it herself, working late into the night to find the right words. Nothing felt adequate. How do you capture the enormity of loss? How do you offer comfort when words seem so small compared to the pain? She had rewritten it a dozen times, each version feeling insufficient. Finally, she had simply written from her heart, trusting that authenticity would matter more than eloquence. As she took her seat near the front of the abbey, Kate felt the weight of expectation. The king sat to her right, his expression grave and thoughtful. He had lived through many such moments in his long life, but each one still affected him deeply. To her left sat William, her husband, who reached over to squeeze her hand briefly. It was a small gesture, but it grounded her. She wasn't alone in this. The service began with a hymn, and hundreds of voices rose together in harmony. The sound filled every corner of the massive space, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Kate sang along, her voice quiet but steady. She glanced around at the faces surrounding her. Some people sang with their eyes closed. Others couldn't sing at all, their emotions too raw. She understood both responses. Grief was never simple or predictable. A religious leader stepped forward to offer an opening prayer. His words were gentle yet powerful, acknowledging the pain in the room while also speaking of hope and resilience. He reminded everyone that they were not alone, that the community stood with them, that love persisted even in the face of loss. Kate bowed her head during the prayer, her own thoughts turning to the families she had met, the stories she had heard, the lives that had been changed forever. Several readings followed, delivered by family members who had volunteered to participate. Each one was different. Some were religious passages offering comfort. Others were poems about memory and love. One young man read a letter his sister had written before she died, her words full of optimism and kindness. By the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the abbey. Kate felt tears sliding down her own cheeks, and she didn't try to hide them. The king would speak next, and then it would be her turn. Kate felt her heart begin to race. She watched as the king rose from his seat and approached the podium. His movements were deliberate and measured, each step carrying the weight of decades of public service. The entire abbey fell into a profound silence. Even the children stopped fidgeting. There was something about his presence that commanded respect without demanding it. He adjusted the microphone slightly and looked out across the congregation with eyes that held both sadness and strength. His speech was brief but impactful. He spoke about duty and compassion, about the importance of community in times of crisis. He acknowledged each family by name, a gesture that clearly moved everyone present. His voice cracked slightly when he mentioned a young boy who had died saving his younger brother from drowning. The king paused, collecting himself before continuing. It was this moment of vulnerability that made him seem more human, more connected to the grief that filled the room. When he finished, he returned to his seat, and the abbey remained silent for several long moments. People were absorbing his words, letting them settle into their hearts. Then the choir began to sing, their voices soft and ethereal. The melody was haunting and beautiful, a wordless expression of sorrow and hope intertwined. Kate used this time to center herself, to prepare for what came next. Her name was called, and she stood. The rustling of her dress seemed impossibly loud in the quiet space. She walked to the podium on legs that felt less steady than they appeared. Every eye in the building was on her. The cameras positioned discreetly around the abbey were recording every moment. But Kate tried to push all of that from her mind. She was here for the families. Nothing else mattered. She placed her notes on the podium and looked out at the sea of faces. For a moment, she was transported back to each individual meeting she had attended. The mother in the small kitchen, making tea with shaking hands while describing her son's love of music. The father in the garden, showing her the flowers his daughter had planted weeks before the accident. The grandmother who kept a bedroom shrine to her grandson, unable to change anything because it felt like erasing him. Kate began to speak, her voice clear but gentle. She didn't start with platitudes or formal greetings. Instead, she opened with a simple truth. She told them that she had come to this day with a heavy heart, knowing that no words she could offer would take away their pain. She acknowledged the inadequacy of language in the face of profound loss. This honesty created an immediate connection. People leaned forward slightly, drawn in by her authenticity. She spoke about the visits she had made, careful not to reveal anything too personal or private, but sharing enough to show that she truly knew these families. She talked about the common threads she had discovered in every home she entered, the love that persisted beyond death, the memories that brought both tears and smiles, the way that grief and gratitude could exist simultaneously, each one amplifying the other. Her words began to build a picture of resilience. She described how she had witnessed extraordinary courage in ordinary people. The teenage sister who had returned to school and started a kindness initiative in her brother's name. The widow who volunteered at a crisis helpline, using her own pain to help others. The parents who had donated their sons' organs, giving life to strangers in the midst of their own devastation. Kate's voice remained steady, but her emotions were clearly present just beneath the surface. She wasn't performing grief or sympathy. She was genuinely moved by the stories she was sharing. The audience could sense this authenticity, and it created a powerful bond between speaker and listener. Even those watching from home through television screens and computer monitors felt drawn into the moment. She then shifted to address the children in the room directly. She knelt slightly, as if bringing herself to their level even though they couldn't see this gesture from their seats. Her voice became even softer, more intimate. She told them that it was okay to feel sad, angry, or confused. She assured them that talking about the person they had lost was a beautiful way to keep their memory alive. She promised them that the pain would change over time, not disappearing but becoming something they could carry alongside their happy memories. Parents clutched their children closer as Kate spoke. Several people nodded in agreement with her words. Others simply wept quietly, their grief acknowledged and validated by someone who seemed to truly understand. The king himself appeared deeply moved, his usual composed expression softened by emotion. William watched his wife with a mixture of pride and concern, knowing how much emotional energy these moments cost her. Kate continued by speaking about the broader community's responsibility. She emphasized that grief doesn't follow a timeline, that these families would need support not just today but in the months and years to come. She called on everyone present to remember these names, these faces, these stories. She challenged people to reach out, to check in, to be present even when it felt uncomfortable or difficult. Her words were a gentle but firm reminder that collective tragedy required collective care. As she neared the end of her prepared remarks, Kate paused. She looked down at her notes, then slowly pushed them aside. What happened next was completely unscripted. She began to speak from her heart, without the safety net of written words. She talked about her own experiences with loss, though she didn't specify details. She acknowledged that even those in positions of privilege and power weren't immune to pain and grief. This vulnerability was unexpected and profound. She spoke about the responsibility she felt in her role, the desire to use her platform meaningfully rather than superficially. She admitted that sometimes she felt inadequate to the task, unsure if anything she did truly made a difference. But then she thought about the people she had met, the hands she had held, the tears she had witnessed. And she realized that showing up mattered, being present mattered, caring deeply mattered. Her voice began to waver now, the emotion finally breaking through her carefully maintained composure. She tried to continue but found herself unable to form words. Tears filled her eyes and spilled over, running down her cheeks unchecked. She didn't wipe them away or apologize for them. She simply stood there, allowing herself to feel the full weight of the moment. The abbey remained completely silent, every person transfixed by what they were witnessing. Kate bowed her head, her shoulders shaking slightly with silent sobs. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered humanity from someone who usually had to maintain perfect control. The vulnerability was stunning and beautiful. It stripped away all pretense and protocol, revealing a woman who genuinely cared about the suffering of others. For several long seconds, she remained in this position, unable to continue but unwilling to walk away. The silence in Westminster Abbey became almost sacred. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed or whispered. Even the photographers lowered their cameras, sensing that this moment transcended documentation. It belonged to the realm of shared human experience, too precious to be reduced to mere images. The ancient walls seemed to hold their breath along with everyone else, bearing witness to something extraordinary. From his seat, the king felt his own eyes welling with tears. In his many years of public life, he had seen countless displays of emotion, both genuine and performed. This was undoubtedly the former. He recognized in Kate something he had always hoped to see in those who served the crown. Not perfection, but authentic compassion. Not polished speeches, but real connection. She had broken through the barrier that so often separated royalty from the people they served. William started to stand, instinctively moving to support his wife, but a gentle hand on his arm stopped him. It was one of the senior clergy members who had organized the service. The elderly man shook his head almost imperceptibly, his expression knowing. This moment needed to unfold naturally without intervention. Kate needed to experience it fully, and the people gathered needed to witness it. Sometimes the most powerful form of leadership was allowing yourself to be vulnerable. In the pews, reactions varied but all stemmed from the same deep well of emotion. The mother who had lost her son felt something shift inside her chest. For months she had carried her grief like a heavy stone, isolated even in crowds, certain that nobody could truly understand. But seeing Kate bow her head, seeing her tears fall freely, she felt less alone. It wasn't that Kate's tears solved anything or brought her son back, but they validated the enormity of what had been lost. They said without words that this pain was real and recognized. A father sitting near the back gripped his wife's hand tightly. He had been struggling to cry since the day of the accident. Everyone kept telling him it was okay to show emotion, but somehow he couldn't unlock whatever gate kept his tears imprisoned. Now, watching Kate break down in front of hundreds of people and millions of viewers, he felt that gate begin to open. Tears started flowing down his face, and his wife turned to embrace him. They clung to each other, finally able to grieve together in a way they hadn't managed before. The children in attendance reacted with the honest confusion and empathy of youth. A young girl tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered, asking why the princess was crying. Her mother, voice thick with emotion, explained that sometimes even princesses feel very sad, and that crying shows how much you care about people. The little girl considered this seriously, then announced that she liked the princess even more now because she had a good heart. From the mouths of children came perhaps the truest assessment of the moment. News reporters positioned throughout the abbey found themselves in unfamiliar territory. They were trained to observe and record, to maintain professional distance from their subjects. But several of them set down their recording devices, their own eyes growing moist. One veteran journalist who had covered the royal family for 3 decades would later write that this was the most genuinely moving moment she had ever witnessed in her career. No amount of media training or public relations strategy could manufacture what was happening. Social media, that constant companion of modern life, exploded with reactions. People watching the live broadcast from their homes, offices, and devices around the world began posting their responses. The hashtag accompanying the memorial service started trending globally within minutes. But unlike the usual cynicism and snark that often characterized online discourse, these responses were overwhelmingly compassionate and supportive. People from different countries, cultures, and backgrounds united in recognizing something profoundly human. Back in the abbey, time seemed suspended. Kate remained with her head bowed, tears continuing to fall. She wasn't trying to stop them anymore or regain her composure. She had surrendered to the moment completely. In that surrender was a kind of strength that few people ever achieve. It took tremendous courage to be this vulnerable in such a public setting, to prioritize authentic emotion over polished presentation. One of the bereaved mothers slowly stood from her seat. She was in her mid-50s, her face lined with recent grief but also with a lifetime of strength. She began walking toward the front of the abbey, her steps tentative but purposeful. Her husband reached out as if to stop her, then let his hand fall back. He understood what she was doing. Others watched as she made her way up the aisle, wondering if she should be stopped, if protocol was being violated. But the king made a small gesture to the security personnel, indicating they should let her proceed. The woman reached the area near the podium where Kate stood. She didn't approach too closely, respecting the space and the moment, but she positioned herself where Kate could see her. Then she did something unexpected and beautiful. She began to applaud. It started as a slow, gentle clapping, not celebratory but reverent. It was the kind of applause that acknowledged effort and authenticity, that said thank you in a way words couldn't quite capture. Another person stood and joined in the applause. Then another. Within moments, the entire abbey was on its feet, hundreds of people clapping in unison. The sound built gradually, growing from a whisper to a wave that filled every corner of the ancient building. It wasn't the thunderous applause of a concert or sporting event. It was something softer but more powerful, infused with gratitude and shared emotion. Kate finally lifted her head, her face wet with tears, her carefully applied makeup now streaked and smudged. She looked out at the standing crowd, initially confused by what was happening. The applause continued, steady and strong. She saw the woman who had initiated it standing closest, nodding at her with an expression of deep understanding. Kate saw the king also on his feet, his hands coming together in approval. She saw William, his face a mixture of concern and pride. She saw the families, the strangers, the clergy, all joined in this moment of collective acknowledgement. The applause wasn't for her status or her title. It wasn't for a job well done or a perfect performance. It was for her humanity, for her willingness to feel deeply and show it openly. It was for creating a space where grief could be honored without shame, where tears were understood as expressions of love rather than weakness. In breaking down, Kate had actually built something up. She had constructed a bridge between isolated suffering and communal healing. She tried to speak, to say something in response, but no words would come. Instead, she placed her hand over her heart and bowed her head again, this time not in sorrow but in gratitude and humility. The gesture spoke volumes. It conveyed appreciation, respect, and recognition of the sacred space they were all occupying together. The applause eventually subsided, fading into a silence that felt different than before. It was no longer heavy with anticipation or grief alone. Now it contained something else, something harder to name but easier to feel. Perhaps it was connection. Perhaps it was hope. Perhaps it was simply the recognition that they had all shared something meaningful together. Kate slowly made her way back to her seat, her legs still unsteady. As she walked past the front rows, several people reached out to touch her hand or arm, gentle gestures of solidarity and thanks. She accepted each one, squeezing back when she could, making eye contact when possible. These small exchanges felt more important than any grand speech or formal ceremony. They were human moments in their purest form. The service continued, but everything that followed existed in the shadow of what had just occurred. Musical performances that would normally have been the highlight of the event became quiet interludes for reflection. Additional readings and prayers took on deeper meaning, as if Kate's breakdown had cracked open something that allowed people to receive these words more fully. The atmosphere in the Abbey had fundamentally shifted. During a hymn, Kate found herself unable to sing. Her voice simply wouldn't cooperate after the tears and emotion. So she stood in respectful silence, listening to the voices around her. She heard wavering notes from people who were also struggling to maintain composure. She heard the clear, pure voice of a child somewhere behind her. She heard the deep, steady bass of the king beside her. All these voices weaving together created something beautiful and imperfect, just like life itself. William leaned closer to her during one quiet moment and whispered if she was okay. Kate nodded, managing a small smile. She was okay, perhaps more okay than she had been in a long time. There was something liberating about having let go so completely, about having stopped trying to maintain an impossible standard of constant control. She had been taught from the beginning that royals must always appear composed, must never let their emotions overwhelm them in public. Today she had broken that rule and the world hadn't ended. In fact, something better had happened. The final portion of the service involved the lighting of memorial candles. Each family was invited to come forward and light a candle in memory of their loved one. The procession took nearly 30 minutes as dozens of families moved slowly to the front of the Abbey. Some walked with confidence, others needed support. Children carried candles carefully, their small faces serious with the responsibility. Each flame added to the growing light, transforming the Abbey from a space of shadowy grief into something that glowed with remembered love. Kate watched every single person who came forward. She had met many of them, but not all. Each face told a story. Each candle represented a life cut short, a future stolen, a family forever changed. The accumulation of so much loss in one space could have been overwhelming, crushing even. But somehow the collective acknowledgement made it more bearable. Shared grief, it turned out, weighed less than grief carried alone. When the last candle had been lit, the Abbey blazed with hundreds of small flames. The effect was breathtaking. Light danced across the stone walls, creating patterns that seemed almost alive. The clergy member who was leading the service invited everyone to take a moment of silent reflection, to think about the people they had lost and the love that remained. The silence that followed was profound, filled with private prayers, memories, and tears. Kate closed her eyes and thought about the families she had come to know. She thought about the teenage boy who had loved astronomy and wanted to be an astronaut. She thought about the young woman who had written poetry and dreamed of publishing a book. She thought about the elderly man who had been married for 50 years and lost his wife to a sudden heart attack. Each life had been rich and full and valuable, ended too soon but not forgotten. When the moment of silence concluded, people began to move slowly toward the exits. The service was over, but nobody seemed in a hurry to leave. Groups formed naturally, people gravitating toward others who understood their pain. Conversations started quietly, sharing memories and offering comfort. The Abbey transformed from a formal setting into something more intimate, a gathering space for healing. Kate remained near the front, knowing that many people would want to speak with her. She was right. One by one, families approached. Some wanted to thank her for her words and her tears. Others simply wanted to be near someone who had acknowledged their pain so openly. A few wanted to tell her more about the person they had lost, to share details and stories that kept their loved one's memory alive. She listened to each person with complete attention. A mother described her daughter's laugh. A brother talked about his sister's terrible jokes. A widower showed her a photo on his phone of his late wife. Kate looked at each picture, asked questions, laughed when appropriate, cried when necessary. She wasn't performing empathy. She was genuinely present for each interaction, no matter how long it took. The king observed these exchanges from a short distance, conversing with other attendees but keeping an eye on Kate. He saw the exhaustion beginning to show on her face, the emotional toll of so many intense interactions, but he also saw her determination to be there for every person who needed her. It reminded him of his late mother in her best moments, when duty and compassion were perfectly aligned. One particularly memorable interaction occurred when a young boy, perhaps 8 years old, approached Kate. He had lost his older sister in a car accident 6 months earlier. The boy had been in the car too and survived with only minor injuries, but the guilt and grief had been consuming him. His mother had brought him to the service hoping it would help with his healing. The boy stood before Kate silent and uncertain. She knelt down to his level, just as she had done outside the Abbey earlier. She didn't rush him or force conversation. She simply waited, present and patient. Finally, the boy spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, asking if she thought his sister could see him from heaven. Kate's eyes filled with tears again as she nodded. She told him that love never ends, that the bond between siblings was forever, and that his sister would want him to be happy. The boy hugged her suddenly, his small arms wrapping around her neck. Kate held him, feeling his tiny body shake with sobs he had probably been holding in for months. His mother stood nearby, her own tears flowing freely, mouthing thank you over and over. When the boy finally pulled back, he looked at Kate seriously and told her she was nice. She smiled through her tears and told him he was brave. These moments continued for over an hour. The king eventually had to leave for another obligation, but Kate remained. She wouldn't leave until she had spoken with everyone who wanted to speak with her. By the time the Abbey finally began to empty, nearly 3 hours had passed since the service officially ended. Kate had spoken with more than 50 families individually, each conversation draining a little more of her energy, but also filling something inside her. William had stayed nearby, occasionally stepping in when he sensed she needed a brief break, but mostly allowing her to do what she clearly felt called to do. The staff at Westminster Abbey had been patient and accommodating, understanding that what was happening went beyond scheduled timelines and protocol. They moved quietly around the edges of the space, beginning to clean up without disrupting the ongoing conversations. The candles continued to burn, their flames growing smaller but still persistent, much like the memory of those being honored. As the crowd thinned, Kate finally allowed herself to sit on one of the pews. Her feet ached from standing in heels for so long. Her voice was hoarse from hours of talking. Her eyes felt swollen from crying. But there was also a sense of profound fulfillment. She had done what she came to do. She had shown up not as a distant figurehead, but as a fellow human being capable of feeling and expressing genuine emotion. One of the event organizers approached her cautiously, asking if she needed anything. Water, perhaps, or a moment alone? Kate accepted a bottle of water gratefully and drank deeply, realizing she hadn't had anything since breakfast. The organizer, a woman in her 60s who had been working with bereaved families for over 20 years, sat down next to Kate, uninvited but not unwelcome. The woman told Kate something she would remember for the rest of her life. She said that in all her years of organizing memorial services and support groups, she had never seen anyone with Kate's level of privilege and platform choose to be so vulnerable. Most people in positions of power, she explained, felt they had to maintain a certain image. They would express sympathy, certainly, and sometimes even genuine care, but they kept a distance, a protective barrier between themselves and the raw reality of grief. Kate had demolished that barrier completely, by crying openly, by admitting her own inadequacy, by bowing her head in that moment of overwhelming emotion. She had given permission for everyone else to be fully human too. The woman explained that this mattered more than Kate probably realized. It would ripple out beyond this day, beyond these specific families. It would change how people thought about grief, about leadership, about the possibility of authenticity in public life. Kate listened to these words with a mixture of humility and uncertainty. She hadn't set out to make a statement or change perceptions. She had simply reached a point where she couldn't maintain the facade anymore. The weight of so much loss, so much pain, had become too heavy to carry while pretending to be unaffected. Her breakdown had been spontaneous and genuine, not strategic or planned. But as the organizer continued talking, Kate began to understand that intention didn't diminish impact. Sometimes the most powerful moments happened when we stopped trying to control outcomes and simply allowed ourselves to be real. Her tears had been her own, born from her own emotional response. But they had given voice to the tears of countless others who had been holding them back, unsure if they were allowed to feel so deeply. William eventually came to collect her, gently suggesting it was time to leave. Kate nodded but asked for just a few more minutes. She walked back to the front of the abbey where the memorial candles still flickered. She stood among them, surrounded by light and memory. She said a silent prayer for each life lost, for each family forever changed, for all those who carried grief as their constant companion. The drive back to Kensington Palace was quiet. Kate stared out the window, watching London pass by. The streets had returned to their normal rhythm of life. People hurried along sidewalks, entered shops, hailed taxis. The world continued turning, indifferent to individual suffering, yet made up entirely of individuals who suffered. It was a paradox she had been contemplating all day. William didn't try to fill the silence with conversation. He understood that Kate needed time to process everything that had happened. He had his own thoughts about the day, his own feelings about watching his wife break down in such a public way. He was proud of her, certainly, but he was also concerned. He knew the toll these emotional experiences took on her, how she absorbed other people's pain and carried it long after events ended. When they arrived home, Kate immediately went to check on their children. They were playing in the nursery, supervised by their nanny, blissfully unaware of the heavy day their mother had experienced. Seeing them happy and safe brought a different kind of tears to Kate's eyes, these ones born from gratitude and love. She hugged each child tightly, breathing in their familiar scent, grounding herself in the present moment. That evening, as news coverage of the memorial service dominated every channel, Kate sat alone in her study. She had deliberately avoided watching any of the coverage, not wanting to see herself in that vulnerable moment replayed endlessly, but she knew it was everywhere. Her phone had been buzzing constantly with messages from friends, family, and colleagues. Most were supportive and complimentary. A few expressed concern about whether such a public display of emotion was appropriate for someone in her position. She thought about those concerns seriously. Had she crossed a line? Had she somehow diminished the dignity of her role by crying so openly? These questions nagged at her, products of years of training about proper royal behavior. But then she thought about the families she had met, the connections she had made, the mother who had initiated the applause. She thought about the little boy who had hugged her and called her nice. Kate opened her journal, something she did irregularly but found helpful during particularly intense periods. She began writing about the day, not trying to be eloquent or profound, just recording her honest thoughts and feelings. She wrote about the fear she had felt approaching the podium, the overwhelming wave of emotion that had crashed over her, the surprising warmth of the crowd's response. She wrote about each family she had spoken with afterward, trying to capture the essence of their loved ones in a few sentences. Hours passed as she wrote. The house grew quiet around her as children were put to bed and staff retired for the evening. William checked on her once, bringing tea and biscuits, leaving them on her desk with a kiss on her forehead before quietly departing. Kate continued writing, the act itself becoming a form of processing and healing. She wrote about the responsibility she felt in her role and how that responsibility sometimes conflicted with her desire to be authentic. She wrote about the pressure to be perfect and the liberation of allowing herself to be flawed. She wrote about grief as both an individual and collective experience, about how witnessing others' pain had connected her to her own losses in unexpected ways. The next morning brought a different kind of reality. Kate woke to find that the memorial service and her emotional moment had become global news. Headlines from around the world focused on those few minutes when she had bowed her head and cried. Some called it groundbreaking. Others called it inappropriate. Most simply called it moving. The images had spread across social media platforms, shared millions of times, dissected and discussed by people who had never met her and never would. She finally allowed herself to watch some of the coverage over breakfast. It was strange seeing herself from the outside, witnessing her own breakdown as others had witnessed it. The cameras had captured everything. The tears streaming down her face, her shoulders shaking the moment she pushed aside her notes to speak from her heart. Watching it felt both intimate and invasive, like reading someone else's diary and discovering it was your own. The commentary was varied. Royal experts debated whether her display of emotion was a departure from traditional protocol. Mental health advocates praised her for normalizing emotional expression. Social commentators analyzed what it meant for modern leadership. Everyone, it seemed, had an opinion about those few minutes in Westminster Abbey. Kate found herself both fascinated and exhausted by the attention. What struck her most, however, were the personal responses. Her private secretary showed her a selection of messages that had poured in from around the world. Thousands of people had written to share their own experiences with grief, to thank her for making them feel less alone, to describe how seeing her cry had given them permission to cry too. Many came from people who had lost loved ones and felt isolated in their grief, believing they needed to be strong for everyone else. One letter particularly moved her. It was from a middle-aged man who had lost his wife 2 years earlier. He wrote that he had been unable to cry at her funeral, too focused on supporting their children and managing practical matters. The grief had frozen inside him, leaving him feeling numb and disconnected. But watching Kate break down during her speech had somehow unlocked something in him. He had finally been able to cry for his wife, and in doing so, had begun to heal. He thanked Kate for her vulnerability, calling it a gift. Reading these messages shifted something in Kate's perspective. She had spent the previous evening questioning whether she had done the right thing, whether her emotional display had been a failure of composure. Now she began to understand it differently. Her tears hadn't been a weakness or a mistake. They had been an act of connection, a bridge between isolated suffering and shared humanity. Sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply feel deeply and allow others to witness that feeling. Over the following days, Kate received an unexpected invitation. Several of the families from the memorial service wanted to meet with her again, this time in a more intimate setting. They wanted to form a support group, a community of people united by loss, and they wanted Kate to be part of it, not as a patron or figurehead, but as a genuine participant. The invitation touched her deeply, but also gave her pause. She discussed it with William, who listened carefully to her thoughts. He understood the appeal of such involvement, but also worried about the emotional toll it would take on her. Kate had a tendency to absorb other people's pain, to carry burdens that weren't hers to carry. He wanted to support her desire to help, while also protecting her well-being. They talked late into the night, weighing the decision carefully. Ultimately, Kate decided to accept the invitation with some boundaries in place. She would attend the monthly meetings when her schedule allowed, participating as fully as she could while also being realistic about her limitations. She wouldn't be able to make every meeting, but she would be as present as possible. The families understood and appreciated her honesty about what she could offer. The first meeting of the support group took place in a community center rather than anywhere official or grand. Kate arrived without security detail, driving herself in a private car. She wore casual clothes, jeans, and a simple sweater, wanting to minimize the distance between herself and the others. When she entered the room, there was a moment of awkwardness as everyone adjusted to having her there. But it passed quickly as people settled into chairs arranged in a circle. The group was facilitated by a trained grief counselor, but the format was open and conversational. People shared updates about their lives, their struggles, and small victories. Some talked about good days and bad days. Others expressed anger at the unfairness of loss. A few shared memories that made everyone laugh through their tears. Kate listened mostly, speaking only when she felt she had something genuine to contribute. At one point, the mother who had initiated the applause at the memorial service turned to Kate directly. She thanked her again for her speech and her tears, but then she said something unexpected. She told Kate that it was also okay to take care of herself, to not feel obligated to carry everyone's grief. The woman explained that sometimes people in helping roles forgot they were human too, with limits and needs of their own. She encouraged Kate to be as kind to herself as she was to others. The words landed heavily. Kate realized she had been so focused on being there for others that she hadn't considered her own need for support and processing. The memorial service had affected her deeply, stirring up her own experiences with loss and sadness. She had been so busy helping others heal that she hadn't tended to her own wounds. The group created space for her to acknowledge this, and she found herself sharing more openly than she had planned. Over the following months, Kate's involvement with the support group became one of the most meaningful aspects of her work. It was private and personal, rarely photographed or publicized. She attended when she could, contributed what she was able, and allowed herself to receive support as well as give it. The relationships she formed were genuine, based on shared humanity rather than status or position. The memorial service and the moment when she bowed her head became a turning point in how Kate understood her role. She began to prioritize authenticity over perfection, connection over protocol. This didn't mean abandoning her responsibilities or ignoring tradition. It meant finding ways to be genuinely present within the constraints of her position. It meant recognizing that vulnerability, when offered sincerely, could be a form of strength. In time, the viral images and endless commentary faded from public attention, replaced by other news and other moments. But for those who had been in Westminster Abbey that day, for the families who had witnessed Kate's tears and felt seen in their own grief, the memory remained vivid and precious. It became a touchstone, a reminder that even in the darkest moments of loss, connection was possible. That sharing pain somehow made it more bearable, that tears were not weakness but evidence of love. Kate kept a small framed photograph on her desk in her private study. It wasn't from the memorial service itself, but from one of the support group meetings months later. The photo showed the whole group together, arms around each other, faces reflecting both sadness and hope. In it, Kate was simply one person among many, united not by title or position but by the universal experience of loving and losing. This, she came to understand, was what truly mattered.